So we have this question of horizons, which I diagrammed like this, and I illustrate by talking about serious scientists at the moment. I'm not talking about artists at the moment. It's a simple view of horizons. It relates to the topic we had listed last week. I think it may be topic 8, transformations. A horizon is something you reach. Let me just put in the extra 2 words. A horizon is a displacement, okay, reached through transformation. Now you may say, why am I putting in technical words, large words? Because this is a complicated field, much worse than chemistry. And I'm dealing with realities that happen to the human subject. I mentioned an illustration of transformation last week, the tadpole becoming a frog. There's a transformation from the tadpole and its swimming pattern to the frog state, and after the transformation it's a frog and it swims another way. It does the breaststroke. Yeah? You know the joke about the man who calls the waiter and says, what's this fly doing in my soup? And the waiter says, I think it's the breaststroke. Okay, so you're displaced into a new horizon. Now when you read through the text, you'll find I have other illustrations of displacements. Somebody who's spaced out, you're in a different world. You're in a world of music, a world of painting. There can be transient displacements. Wordsworth talks about the change of the world. You see things differently. And one of the dangers of our culture is a recurrence of the notion of, look at that in the cold light of day. There's a sense in which the cold light of day is quite mistaken. Twilight, midnight, you may be at the edge of a transformation, what Joyce calls an epiphany, and you're displaced. You hear different, you hear the music different, you see the painting different, you see your friend's face differently. Now, in our elementary, or my elementary presentation, I'm talking about, say, serious science. And we're in trouble straight away. That's why I talk about serious understanding. Because science, for a lot of you, means a lot of numbers. Science means, in the Greek and the Latin tradition, scientia, understanding. What you need of a friend is science. But if you say to your friend, I'm working towards a scientific understanding of you, oh, yeah, what reaction will you get? Cool it, eh? No, science is understanding. And serious science is serious understanding, whether it's physics or chemistry or schizophrenia. Now, that is a horizon shift. And it may not happen that often, even in science departments. I spent a year in Concordia running a seminar for professors, God help us. But anyway, the chair of chemistry at that stage came to me one day and said, you know, Phil, in our department, they can get through with memory work and cooking. You're able to, you know, cook up the mixtures and qualitative chemistry and that, and memorize the stuff. And he was appreciating that you didn't cross this horizon. A mathematician in New York told me about 3 months ago that he found the graduate students didn't understand mathematics, but they were very competent. Now, we're going to get back to this on the topic of technique. So a serious understanding is something that you have to spend a lot of time on. In Wealth Chapter 1, I tell the story, which I heard from Bernard Lonergan in 1961. That's a while back. But it's a very telling story about Einstein and the lady who comes and invites him to tea. And he comes to tea, and she's delighted, and they're having afternoon tea. And she works up the courage to say, well, you know, Mr. Einstein, I'm really delighted to have you to tea, but now I'd like to ask you, and in my own simple words, I'd like to know, what is relativity theory? Huh? She didn't have any idea of the fact that I can't tell you. Einstein worked out special theory of relativity with 3 other major breakthroughs in 1904, 1905. He spent another 10 years trying to work towards a general theory, 1915. What was he doing? He was understanding. Could he communicate that at an afternoon tea? No. It's way beyond us. And it's very human to acknowledge that. Being human means being in a large group where some of us do really good, as you say in Canada. And you can be astonished by these people. One of the women that dominates the book process is a French woman, Nadia Boulanger. An incredible woman. The American composer Aaron Copland remarked that Nadia knew all of music from pre-Bach to post-Stravinsky, and she knew it cold. She was the first woman to conduct symphonies in the 30s. Yeah? This is you know, a woman moving into that male domain of conductor. She conducted in Boston, New York, in the late 30s. A remarkable horizon of music, quite beyond us. Does that make sense to you? It's the beyond that's important. We trivialize ourselves and our great companions in history so easily. And we can do it in the university. Strauss, one of the American writers on the history of culture, talks about the lion-tamer mentality that I mentioned last week. That you're lecturing on Goethe as if you knew anything about him. You're giving a course on James Joyce. When we get as far as Molly Bloom, we'll find that Joyce spent, well over a decade writing this book about one day. Yeah? One day, 16th of June, Dublin, 1904. Ends up with Molly in bed, talking. And then he spends the next 15 or so years writing a book about one night. And what was he doing? It's quite beyond us. It's beyond our horizon, but it's part of our quest. Like Don Quixote expresses each of us, when that was part of Joyce's effort, that we are all huge. Paddy Kavanagh, the Irish poet, has a lovely verse which I sometimes apply to myself. He had the knack of making men feel as small as they really were, which meant as great as God had made them, though as males they disliked his air. Great yet small. So there are horizons. And now, as I say, I'm emphasizing just the scientific one of physics and chemistry, the simple sciences. Some of you are puzzled by that remark. Some of you, and the culture shares it with you, are convinced that chemistry is more difficult than philosophy. Yeah? And physics is more difficult than chemistry. Physics is a very easy science. Chemistry is a little more difficult. Botany is grim. Zoology, whew, far out. But the way we think of these things, it's reversed. Yeah? You come to the university and you got your grades from high school, and the counselor says, well, how did you do? And you say, well, yeah, I did well in math, and I did a little science. Oh, well, then you could do physics, mathematics. Well, I didn't do so well in mathematics and that, but I enjoyed botany, you know, looking at flowers. Well, you might do biology. Yeah? Well, I didn't do so well in botany, but I'm a people person. Oh, well, then you could try psychology or sociology. Well, I'm sort of very slow. Oh, well, you know, there's a philosophy course. I'm really freaky. Well, try religious studies. And the notion is that they get easier as you go up. Isn't that true? Yeah? If I was giving this course not on reason and religious belief, but on quantoelectrodynamics and the spectrum of matrices in later, would I have anyone here? But it's a simpler topic. I recall in my days in mathematical physics studying the energy of the electron, the self-energy of the electron. A sticky problem in physics. We're studying the self-energy of us, and it's far more difficult. But we live in a culture which tells us that, no, physics is difficult, but we're all pretty obvious. So we have this struggle to peak, and we get little glimpses of it by humbly doing these puzzles. I'm taking the advice of René Descartes in the great turmoil of the 1630s, 40s, 50s. He said, attend to little things. Find out something about yourself. That, oh, I can't do this blessed puzzle. Okay. It's a little horizon shift. Okay, so you have people who do serious science like Einstein, Newton, and so on, and they are beyond the horizon of common sense. And that was what Socrates was pointing towards. What is courage? I don't know. What is love? I don't know. And you have in these dialogues of Plato, Plato wrote dialogues including Socrates in the chat. And the process is that somebody talks and says, well, now, I'll tell you what love is. And then Socrates comes in and says, well, now, what about this and what about that? And they find out, no, we haven't crossed this horizon. Now, this horizon is sort of established in physics and chemistry. It's not too healthy in the upper sciences. I like joking about the fact that Konrad Lorenz got a Nobel Prize in the 70s for discovering that zoology was about live animals. You can get a degree in zoology and see nothing alive except the fruit fly. You're cutting up dead things all the time. Okay. So, serious understanding, yeah? That's the second horizon. Now, what's this third horizon? You can ask, what is understanding? If you do chemistry, you develop an understanding of chemicals. You don't develop an understanding of understanding. That's not a topic in chemistry. There may be chemists listening to me now, and in the book I talk about a biologist I knew in Oxford, and he resented enormously me telling him that he didn't know what biology was. He'd been doing it for years. You can do something and not know what you're doing. Does that make some sense? We'll develop it under the topic technique. So the horizon we're pushing for now is understanding. Okay, understanding me, and part of me is understanding. Okay? Let me put this back into the diagram I had already. We puzzled about some mess, okay? The mess, say, of the letters. Okay, instead of the letters, think of you. I think Paul Simon has a song about the puzzle that is me. I think it's in the one, The Dangling Conversation. Any of you remember Paul Simon, or was that before your time? He's still on the go with these. African songs, and he's in trouble at the moment, I think, in South Africa. Okay, me. Who am I? So you have a question about me, and me is someone who occasionally understands. So if you understand me, you're understanding your self-understanding. That's very tricky. Let's not be in a rush about that. We'll go round and round that topic. Bernard Lonergan, that I've mentioned and will keep quoting, he wrote a big book called Insight, 800 pages in total. And in the preface he says, understand what it is to understand and you will have a basis, an enormous basis for living, seeing what's wrong with culture, and so on. And at this point, I want to make a point that is troubling some of my listeners and readers, and that is that there's a double flow in my lectures. I'm trying to teach a very elementary course, and to that elementary course belongs this sort of puzzle. But I'm also trying to indicate or intimate the dimensions of this enterprise. This big book by Lonergan is 800 pages on the question of understanding, a study of human understanding. And he shows its absence, both understanding and an understanding of understanding, in most fields of modern inquiry. Now, part of my effort is not only to do the elementary stuff, but to have throwaway pointers at larger issues. This is part of good teaching in any field. When I was teaching mathematical physics, well, we could handle the Newtonian equation, but it's very enjoyable to stop and say, well, now look, when you move from this to, say, planetary motion or galactic motion or an Einsteinian perspective, and yeah, you get a peek of the peak. But the main thing is not to be discouraged by that. What we're aiming at immediately is this self-discovery. But some of you are in other areas, honors English, economics, and so I throw out hints. But that's not a discouragement. That's particular to various people that are interested. That this is not a very small topic. It has relevance across the board to English studies, to economics, biology, so on. And that is as it should be, because there is a notion that theology, philosophy of religion, is somehow a queen, yeah? The queen of the sciences, that it has something to say about physics and chemistry and botany and zoology and literature. Yeah? But in our elementary course, although I give these throwaway indications, we get back to these all the time. Don't get mad keen on following up. Well, you may, but do it in your spare time. If you're doing 5 credits, certainly don't do it until April. Life begins in April. Okay. So understanding me involves understanding understanding. And in a larger sense, and now I'm leaping down here, it means minding. Minding what? Minding me. Me, who's me? Me's a minder, I hope. Minding, or minding me, the minder. Okay, and again, you've got to come back and ask yourself, am I a minder? Do I mind at all? Couldn't care less. In the book I mentioned the British television program. Did it ever get to Canada, The Minder? Dennis Waterman was the character in it who was the minder. A minder is sort of like a bodyguard in the mafia, but it's in the British tradition. And many of you heard of this program or saw it, yeah? A very good 1-hour show. And the minder is a sort of sidekick for the gangster. And he's, I think you'd call it running interference, that sort of thing. Not quite a hitman. Dennis Waterman was the character in this. In fact, he is known as a minder in social work in England. He's the son of a Clapham Junction ticket collector, 9th child in the family. But he grew up to be a minder, a carer. So you may have that question that, no, I've been drifting for years. I don't mind at all. Don't mind if I do. Don't mind if I don't. Don't mind at all. Yeah? Give me the credit and let me out of here. Okay, so minding, the minder that is me. And that's what we're trying to do. And the direction in which we're going is to discover that this minder is a desire that goes beyond anything finite. But we're not getting into that immediately. First thing is to notice, well, is the minder alive? And the sad part of it is that the Socratic advice was the unexamined life is not worth living. Know thyself. And people keep quoting that and never doing it. And we have a culture willing to look under the bonnet of the car on Saturday and never look under its own bonnet. Reisman, the American sociologist, wrote a book in the 60s called The Lonely Crowd, talking about the drift of American culture from inner directedness of the founding fathers to other directedness of the present culture. You're really doing what you know the other person wants you to do. You get it in that film, The Graduate. You get into this and, yeah, you echo back what the other person wants. And he brings out at the end of the book, and he says, if only people would notice the dimensions of their own desires, their own loneliness. So that's what we're up against. Now you may ask me, is that philosophy? My claim is that this is philosophy, that this is what Socrates did, and Plato did, and Aristotle did, and Aquinas did. It's not what they do in the universities. Linguistic analysis is a dominant philosophic mode in North America, and we'll talk about it a little later. If you like, I'm trying to get you back to the Socratic perspective. Know thyself. Who am I? And it's tough work. What's the data for this course? We talked about the beginning of the first evening, morning, whatever show you're watching. The data is you. And this is self-discovery. Okay, so that's the horizon we're aiming at, and it's tough work. And you may not have this horizon, so instead of this horizon, we put in these puzzles. And one of the dodges I use to get you to notice this horizon is to notice when it's absent and when you're being cheated or when you're living in technique. So we're back to the question of techniques. Now basically, what's a technique? It's a way of doing something without understanding what you're doing. Okay? And your life is full of these. Do you know what it is to drive an automobile? Yeah? And many people know what it is to drive an automobile. I don't. I don't drive. Yeah? Are you sure you know what it is to drive an automobile? No, you know how to drive. Some of you may know what it is. You know something about combustion, so on. But most of us know the technique. Now, we ended up the last day with this lovely technique. Anyone work it out? For multiplying. Yeah? You remember this? Some of you are fresh into the class. Okay, you want to multiply numbers above 5. Okay? Are you with me? Yeah? So instead of learning the tables, 6 by 6 is 36. Many of you learn these in school. Sometimes I'm not sure what goes on in schools in Nova Scotia. Or in Newfoundland, if you're out there. Well, we memorize these tables. 6 1s are 6, 6 2s are 12, 6 3s are 18, all the way up to, we stopped at 10, I think, or was it 12? Yeah, 6 12s. We went up to 6 12s. I don't know why. We never went to 13. So you just didn't know what 6 13s were. Yeah? You could say, yeah, 6 12s, 72. 6 13s. Okay, now that was memorization. You didn't understand. Okay, so now here's a technique that saves you memorizing 6 times tables, 7 times, and so on. So you take your fingers, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we did it the last day. 7 7s. Okay, that's the problem, isn't it? So you join those and you count the fingers joined and the below as 10s. Okay? So what do you get? You get 40. Yeah? 40 and 3 by 3. 49. Okay? Isn't that nice? Now, 8 8s. Yeah? 60, 2 by 2. 4. 9 9s. 81. 9 10s. 90. Okay, 9 fingers. And 1 by 0. Isn't that terrific? Yeah? So you can learn a technique, and it can be fascinating. And one of your problems is to notice, am I interested, am I not? Am I fascinated? Am I bored? Am I generally bored? When did I die? And it's a very important question, and do ask your friends about it, especially if they've drink taken. Okay, so you have a technique. Now, nobody wrote in and told me why it worked. But it's a nice technique, isn't it? And you know it works because you already know the answer. Fair enough? 9 9s, yeah, 81. Okay, so it's a technique. You don't understand the technique, but you can do it. And it works because you know the answer. Okay? Now, I'm going to mention 4 techniques here. There's that technique, and I'm still waiting for somebody to give me to figure it out. It's great fun trying to figure it out. Some of you asked me, well, is it important to figure things out? No. No, what's important is to discover what you do when you figure something out, or at least try. Love is a wonder when first it's new. I'm trying to renew wonder and love and openness, and yeah, unless you become as little children. And you may still be under the notion that, well, I'll wait until he's finished all this simple-minded junk, and he talks about Hinduism and Taoism, because I want philosophy of religion. That's a mistake. Okay, so the effort, it's worth the effort to find out that, yeah, golly, I can do this, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Okay, now, 3 other techniques I want to talk about. One I won't get into, the technique of getting square roots, which you will find in the Little Book Wealth, page 2021. It's a technique, it's like this one. You can learn it. Some of you learned it in school. We'll do it now just for the fun of it. And raise the question, how does it work? A larger technique is the technique of the ISLM curve in economics. And many of you are doing economics. Many of you know about this curve, yeah? It's a dominant technique of adjusting the economy. It relates to increasing the money flow, increasing or decreasing the interest rate. It's a technique. Now, the first 2 techniques work, okay? The second 2 techniques work occasionally, but the ISLM technique is just wrong. So you can get stuck in a technique, and it doesn't work, And unless somebody does some very heavy thinking and horizon shifting, you keep on doing the wrong thing. So it's very important to think out, what is a technique? It's, unless you know the results, it can be a tremendous trap. And the fourth technique I want to talk about is the technique called talking. It's the universal human technique, pretty well. We learn how to talk. And I'll push on into that when we talk about Helen Keller. Socrates criticized people because they didn't know what they were talking about. I'm pushing it a little further in the sense that I'm pointing out that there's a technique called talking and that you don't know what you're doing when you're talking. Isn't that fun? Okay. So the square root. We're running into a chalk crisis. This is a very expensive course, audiovisual aid. Okay. How many of you remember taking square roots in school? Yeah? Vaguely, way up back. Oh dear. All right. So, how do you do this? Well, you get a number like 85849. Okay, what's the square root of 85849? Any suggestions? Yeah? Okay. Well, how do you get it? Well, I'll show you how, okay? Are you all with me? Are you all excited? Yeah? Can you imagine going home to one of your friends and say, what did you do in philosophy of religion? We learned to get square roots. Okay, what do? You divide this number in twos in pairs. And then you find there's either one or two left at the end, okay? Now, I do that just for convenience. What do you do then? You find a number whose square is less than 8. And the next number is too big, okay? Now, what number, when squared, is less than 8, and the next number, squared, is bigger than 8? Wow, we're on the move. 2. Okay. So you put the 2 up there, and you put the 2 down there, and you square it, and you take it off the 8, and you get 4. Okay? Then you bring down this pair, 58. Okay? Now what do? You double the 2, okay? Double whatever number you've got here. And now you have to find a number, let's call it x, such that x by 48 is smaller than that, and 4x plus 1 by x plus 1 is bigger than that. Isn't this marvelous? So you want a number like, say, 6. 6 by 46. Yeah? Would that be okay? Yeah? What do you think? 7. 47 by 7. 7 sevens are 49. 7 nines. No, 7 fours are 28. And 4. Ah, you're not with me at all. 28 and 4. See? All right, 32. Well, it's not big enough, okay? You need a bigger number. Well, maybe 8. Maybe 9. 49 by 9. 9 nines are 81, 9 fours are 36, and 8 is 44. Okay. Looking good, eh? Yeah? We happy? So, all right. (49 by 9) is that. That looks good. You put it in here, 441. You subtract it and you get 7 and 1. You put the 9 up here, of course. Okay. You double the number up here again and put it down here. Isn't it fun? Are you fascinated? You get 58. Now you've got to do the same thing again. You have to find a number, let's call it y, such that y by that is smaller than, yeah, bring that down, smaller than that or equal to it. Now when you did this in school and you got homework, the teacher always made sure that it did have a square root. Do you remember that? You knew you were wrong if it didn't work out. Isn't that, yeah, the normal school exercise? Yeah? Okay, so if you look at 58, yeah, not too much thinking maybe shows you that. If you try 3, yeah, what do you get? Multiply by 5, 8, 3 by 3. What do you get? 3 3s are 9, 3 8s are 24, 3 5s are 15, 16, 17. Isn't that marvelous? Are you excited? We've got the square root of this number now. And you can do that with any number. Isn't it terrific? Yeah? I know you've all got these calculators, so you don't have to do this anymore. It's just another technique. It's a technique. Why does it work? Yeah? You don't know. Possibly when you were in school and you were still alive, you asked the teacher. You put up your innocent, curious little hand and said, "Teacher, oh, that's nice, but why does it work?" And the teacher says, "Don't bother me, just learn the rule and do this homework." Yeah? And the sad situation is, and a professor of mathematics told me this about graduate students. I talked to him one day about this, and he tried it out on his graduate students. They didn't know how this worked. The sad thing is that you have teachers teaching techniques, and they don't know why it works. Huh? So you get it's called decline, a situation of decay. Okay, so that's a technique that actually works. Now, I'm suggesting, and I know the economists will be shocked, that there's another technique associated with this sort of graph, ISLM curve, and it's a technique that doesn't work. And it has a history. And I'm not going into it, but some of you may be interested in following it up. There's a good doctorate thesis here. This has its origin, well, it depends on what economist you talk to, especially some of the good British ones. It goes back to a man called Walras in the 1870s. An English economist, Nicholas Caldor, says it goes back to the 6th chapter of Book 1 of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's a mistake. It's economic statics. It doesn't take in the waves. When Keynes wrote the book in 1936, his friend Robinson wrote to him, she had the galleys and said the proofs, and said, I find sections of the middle of this book totally obscure. And Keynes wrote back and said, so do I. So it came out anyway, and then it was simplified in 1937 by a man called Hicks. And it's been on the go ever since. And pretty well everyone knows that stabilization policy doesn't work. And there's another view. How do you get the other view? By puzzling about what actually goes on in the economy. And what goes on is an aggregate of rhythms. And part of the trouble with this is that economists are like people standing on the beach. The tide comes in naturally in waves, and they're trying to flatten out the tide. Or I like to imagine economists as people driving along in a gear shift car, and it's in first gear. They know nothing about the gearbox, of course. They're just driving along. This is terrific. And it gets overheated, so they all get out of the car and paint it. Okay, so the problem I'm introducing is technique. That techniques are things you learn to do without knowing what you do. Some of them work. Now, my last technique is talking. Talking works. But not only do we not know most of the time what we're talking about, we don't know what we're doing when we're talking. Now, this is worth an hour, and we don't have an hour. But let me at least introduce this problem. What is it to talk is my problem. It's a technique we're all familiar with. Up here I talk about understanding, understanding. I wrote down understanding, understanding. When we do a puzzle like this, first I've got to get you to understand the puzzle and then understand what you did. In the case of talking, I know that you all can talk. Okay? It's common to everybody here. I think it's probably common to most of my audience, to all my audience. Yeah. That baby there doesn't. Yeah? Okay. So I'm talking to talkers, and I want us to ask, what is it to talk? In other words, let's take this technique. It's of much broader interest than what is it to get square roots? What is it to multiply with your fingers? What is it to talk? Now, this is a problem we meet in text and psychology. The general area is, how do children go from babbling to talk? If you look up your psych books, you'll find there's a few pages on theories of this transition. There may be half a dozen theories. There's Chomsky, there's Piaget, and so on. Some of you have done that, yes? The transition to talk. What happens? And it's marvelously illustrated by the life of this woman, Helen Keller. And it's something that's well worth working at very slowly. How many of you know this story of Helen Keller? Yeah? A few of you seen the film? It's a magnificent film. It's black and white, 1962, directed by Arthur Penn. Anne Bancroft, Patty Duke, both got Oscars for it. And it really does bring out this transition of Helen Keller. The only flaw in it is that Patty Duke doesn't represent a 6 3/4-year-old child, which Helen was at the time. So you've got Helen at 6 3/4, and she is like the non-talking 1-year-old. A very energetic, even vicious little girl. And she makes this transition from babbling to talk. What happened? Now, in the textbooks of psychology, you'll find regularly at the end of the discussion, a great deal more research has to be done. Okay? What we're going to do here is research. But the research is not, get me another 1,000 children. No, the research is myself discovering what I did using my imagination, my memory, and imagining my way along with Helen Keller. Fair enough? And let's try and develop that imagination. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to understand something about ourselves that we've been doing fairly successfully since we were 3 or 4. Helen since she was 6 3/4. Okay, let's try and imagine Helen Keller. It's a little girl, and she is deaf and she is blind. And I'm going to draw a little diagram that will help us. There is Helen Keller at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6. And within her, what we've already talked about, identified a little bit. There is sensibility, okay. There is whatting. And then there's ising. And there are other elements we didn't talk about today. Action elements. What am I going to do? Now, I'm going to concentrate on this zone. Now, we identified very vaguely the elements in ourselves. Very vaguely. That yeah, we have sensibility, we are whatters, we sometimes get insights, and sometimes formulate concepts. Very vague identification. Now, we have sensibility, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, kinesthesia. Helen doesn't have seeing or hearing, okay? So you're trying to imagine somebody who has taste, touch, smell, and kinesthetic sensibility. A sense of, say, rocking motion. And then the various touch senses. And then the taste and the smell. And if you watch that film, you'll find that Helen could smell her brother, her mother, her father, so on. Smell soup, rainwater. And generally, a person like that develops the sensibilities they have much better than we do. Okay, so Helen is a non-seeing, non-hearing child of 6 3/4. And let me draw this out. This is just a convenience now. I want to draw out sort of a history, if you like, of Helen's sensibility and her whatting. Okay, let's go back across the blackboard. All right. Yeah, okay, let's make that March 3rd, 1887. If you read Helen's autobiography, or Annie Sullivan was the woman who turned up this day in Helen's house in Alabama. Helen's biography is marvelous about this. She turns up on that day, and what we're aiming at is something that happened on April the 5th, about 5 weeks later. What happened to Helen? I remember going and seeing that film with a very learned professor in Oxford, and we came out and he was really delighted with the whole thing, but he said, well, what happened in the end? What really happened? Okay, Miss Sullivan turns up, and prior to that, let's draw out this field of sensibility and whatting. Helen is alive and curious, and she writes in her autobiography about the energy she had and the curiosity. So Helen is really puzzling. She's a very puzzled little girl and a very angry little girl, and a desperate need, as she says, to communicate, touch. Gradually it emerged that this is a very bright girl. Her parents thought that she was mentally defective. They were going to put her in an institution. So Helen is alive mentally, but she is dumb. Now, on March the 3rd, Annie Sullivan turns up, this strange Irish woman who actually had been blind and got her sight through a set of operations. And she had learned the sign language for the deaf. And on our very first afternoon with Helen, she started using the sign language, which Helen had not come across before. And she started doing, there was a doll in the room. Now, you've got to imagine this blind, deaf girl. What has to be done is, it's by touch, okay? The girl, Annie invites the girl to touch her hand, and she does. And Helen, in her autobiography, talks about her eagerness and her monkeyness to imitate, and thought it was a marvelous finger game, and got into this. So it was a terrific game. And that's what it was, and it's a rather strange experience for somebody living in that world, that she has a stream of sensitive consciousness, okay? The normal things of eating, bathing, smelling her relations, touching trees, feeling her way around the house, finding out a key, locking her mother into a room, being very naughty at times and very vicious. She has a stream of consciousness right up to the 3rd of March, and then there's a change. The stream continues, but this finger game comes up on the side. And it's delightful, but it's annoying too, especially when Annie starts making her behave herself and trying to make her civilized, if you like, and stop being spoiled. And the parents didn't like this. But besides all that, there was this recurrence of this experience. They played this finger game, and one of the topics that kept, or one of the pieces of the game that kept coming up was this. Now look at that, that's very complicated, isn't it? It's a funny game. And you know, did you learn finger games when you were small? Like, you know, this one, and if you put your fingers the wrong way, you can't do it. Yeah? Or the one with the church. Did you do these things when you were small? No? What did you do when you were small? Okay, so this was one of the finger things that Annie kept repeating in the presence of any type of water. Soup, streams, and Helen would hold the hand, and she could imitate the movements. And then one particular day in the film, they make a sort of a very particular day of it. She rushes out of the dining room. That isn't in fact in the autobiography. They happen to be in the presence of a pump, and the pump is pumping water, and something happens. What happened? You have a sequence of events right up to the present moment. That X stands for that very complex movement. Yeah? Which spells water. And Helen had the finger game. She could do this. But suddenly, in the yard, there's this jump, this transformation that displaced Helen permanently. New world. And what was the jump? Okay, let's put it down larger. You have something sensible, movement of a hand. You have something else sensible, flow from a tap, and there's a leap of insight. Okay? Now notice what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get an insight into an insight. What insight? The insight we all got so easily because we can see. Her insight in her darkness was that points to that. Okay? And further. That points to that and to everything I mean by water. And that's very difficult to figure out. But the elementary part of it is that that points to that. And Helen became quite frantic at that stage and rushed around learning the pointers. Yeah. Annie Sullivan, teacher, mother, father. So the transition is an insight that connects sign and signified. And that is the transition to language. Why is it interesting for us? Because we all did that without knowing what it was. That jump that made us talkers. Now, I said it points to, and we have to talk a lot more about that as we go along. Where does the word point? In a simple version, the word points to the water. But where does the word really point? And this is where I'm going to leave you puzzling. Where does the word point? If Molly Bloom instead of Helen says Poldy. It's a word, isn't it? Poldy was Leopold, that was her husband, Poldy. You'll find, and I'm leading you now towards next week, pages 34 to 37 of the book of Process. And I'm inviting you to read it in a desperately serious sense. Molly Bloom says Poldy. What does Poldy point to? Poldy, I remember 16 years ago, and so on. If you happen to have the book Ulysses, you'll find that Molly talks for 40 pages at the end of the book, and there are no full stops. It's one sentence, and it's magnificent. And you'll find in the book that I have an abbreviated version, page 36 and 37. But the question I'm asking you to think about is what does the word point to? And I'm suggesting that it doesn't point in the simple-minded way that we think of, point to, yeah, Leopold, the husband, of course, yeah. Poldy, that's Poldy. No, the word points backwards to the person talking. Yeah? Remember when I said Mahler's last word was Mozart? What was the word? What did it point to? It pointed to a life of Mahler's effort to appreciate Mozart. Now, it also points towards the real Mozart. Mahler's really trying to get to Mozart. A religious person can think of a word of significance in religion. What does the word Jesus point to? Yes, certainly it points to a Galilean. But also it points inwards. The person praying the word has a resonance of meaning. So words primarily point inwards. And this is part of our conversation. Somebody says to you, I want to tell you what this means to me. What Joe means to me. Joey means such and such to me. Well, they want to tell you something about themselves. Joey means a lot to me. So the word is pointing inwards to an achievement of the subject, and it may be a horizon completely beyond you. And again, we're back at the problem. It gives you a peek at a peak within the other person. It's an invitation to listen. And let's leave it at that.